You're all good.
Well, welcome, everybody. This is one in a series of LA Lunch and Learns. It's been the first one in a while, first time probably many of you have been here, but there are some previous Lunch and Learns that we went through that we have copies of and be happy to send you. The last one was about landscape plans and how we present them, how we figure them out in both Baltimore County and Howard County. But this one, Christie asked to sort of make the topic about we do layouts, planning. So I titled this Lunch and Learn Planning Strategies. It's pretty simple. The copy of this will be prepared, and after the meeting, we don't have copies of this presentation to hand out in advance or immediately after the meeting. There's some context I still need to sort of put into here, but I'm going to go through some folders to share some case studies of how we have laid out other projects in the past or different types of projects. But I just thought I'd go through a quick overview of how we try to do our layouts, and like Ed and Bill to chime in, or anyone, if you have any questions at any time, just raise your hand. That's for everybody out there in virtual land as well. So just sort of moving on. First, I just wanted to start off our presentation with paying homage to the father of landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted. This year is his 200th birthday. So I didn't know if everyone was aware of that. He was born in 1822. And here we are in 2022, 200 years later. Share that tidbit. He was responsible for a lot of significant park planning and the whole term landscape architecture. He actually coined it. And then his sons actually carried on a business called the Olmsted Brothers, which actually has done a lot of work here locally in the Baltimore area. But I just wanted the sort of first thing to really think about is the context of the property that you're working on. What is the land use type? I've sort of broken this down into three sort of approaches. One, we approach the layout differently depending on the land use. For commercial and institutional properties, there's certain dimensions and approaches that we take as opposed to residential properties. That's another. Multifamily and single family are the three categories. So multifamily, we're going to talk about how to lay out multifamily properties or how we have in the past. Single family properties and commercial / institutional properties. And I think one of the key things to sort of know in each of those types of land uses is if the building footprint dimensions are sort of very important to make sure you understand and you have that information up front. Understand basically the building orientation. How do you want to face the front door of the building is sort of a key sort of early one point. The dimensions of vehicular traffic is something to really understand, and that includes truck traffic and the turning radiuses for trucks, as well as cars, deliveries, those sorts of things. The vehicular traffic dimensions are usually bigger, greater, and more significant in how the actual layout ultimately turns out than the pedestrian traffic. That's why I put the pedestrian traffic, including ADA access, sort of after vehicular traffic. It's just the roads are bigger, the parking lots are bigger. You got to make sure you have room to move those vehicles and trucks around efficiently and practically. And the other sort of overall approach we take is we do the layout first and then the grading. I'm not saying the grading is not important, it is, but if you just take the property boundaries and look at it as a flat pancake and sort of analyze it dimensionally, which way to orient parking, which way to orient the footprint, which way is the front door, get those sort of layout issues important and done right first, then figure out, okay, here's where we need retaining walls, or here's where we need to have slope to sort of make it all work great. So just, that's sort of a very simple sort of breakdown. So first of all, these are commercial and institutional projects and case studies I sort of go through. And I'll start with Sparks Lot 5. These are a series of sketches that we did for Sparks Lot 5. And this is a fairly complicated shape to a property. It's accessed from a cul-de-sac up at the north end of the site. North is usually always straight up on our plans. And there's also a fair amount of topography on this site. But ignoring that for the time being, this was sort of some basic layouts of the building footprints, the orientation of the buildings, and sort of what, which way we really wanted to turn those. And go back to the next. This was another. So this was another way that we could reconfigure the same building footprints, orient it to the front, and begin to sort of think about some of those dimensions of parking that are going to be required and how efficient are the remaining sort of areas adjacent to the primary circulation, how many bays of parking can be fit. We're not even thinking really about stormwater management at this point, because often stormwater on an odd shaped property like this often will fill in sort of odd corners and spaces for the most part. And like I said, the idea is really to get the layout right first and the orientation really settled right. So this is just a sketch where we really quickly are laying out some of those key dimensions. This was another sort of study we did, sort of following that first orientation, but the building was decided, well, what if we come in and we route the orientation, we face it sort of towards the east in this case, bring the access around, what's left for parking. So these are really, really quick studies that we do just to sort of begin to and there's a so then in this study, we flip the building the other way. What if we come in and face it to the west? And again, sort of, there was a grade issue, so we knew we had to have a certain amount of linear roadway to get down to where the entrance was, since we're sort of shifting that entrance downhill. And again, there were these 60-foot dimensions of parking were sort of laid out to sort of fit in the remaining space. And there's often a lot more of these studies done than Biden actually sees, but then this was another one. So I just wanted to share these really, really rough sketches that toss around those key ideas. Which way we orient the building, what is the building footprint, and how does the parking fit into the remaining layout? AP Columbia was another interesting that we developed. This is the so in this case, we had an architect that we were working with, and they sort of had a location established for the building already on the site. This was just sort of a real quick study that we did and said, hey, how can we orient the parking? We knew the entrance was at the south end of the site. We wanted to have the building up here. I think there was a major highway to the north there. I forget which road it was, but we wanted that visibility access to the north. And we were actually looking at stormwater, the grading of the property, and how can we sort of fit these bays parking in there, and every 2 bays, work in a stormwater pond and have another 2 bays parking. These arrows are basically showing the client how the slope would occur. And obviously where we had a steeper cross slope, we knew that we had to sort of terrace the parking with stormwater sort of down the hill. Where it was a flatter cross slope, we knew we could run the stormwater parallel to parking. So again, we're just thinking about the orientation of, we get the building footprint right, we get the orientation right. Now we're thinking, here's where the parking has to sort of lay out. And here are some of the grading implications of that. Where's the stormwater going to go? So this was, I think, a critical steps that we had done that project. And this was an example of sort of the end result that we came up with. The red line sort of represents an initial phase that KP wanted to do, and then the second phase with the amount of parking. And just in addition, this is in Howard County. Howard County had certain landscape requirements, which, by the way, I think in some of our previous discussions, one of the big differences between Howard County and Baltimore County's landscape requirements, you may have heard me say this before, is Howard County really focuses about the perimeter of the site, making sure you've got landscaping around the perimeter. They really don't have a lot of heavy requirements for the internal part of the site. And this sort of shows that they wanted 10, sometimes 20-foot setbacks around the perimeter. In Baltimore County, we don't have that. They actually have requirements for the perimeter as well as the interior. So the landscaping is spread out. Just want to share, there was sometimes phasing. This was an example of when phasing was sort of important. So the phasing, you can see it changed a little bit from that red. We decided that rather than pushing all that parking so remote in the initial phase, we wanted the parking in the initial phase to get closer to the building. And then the second phase was then parking was added more remotely. And the second phase of the building was built. So phasing sometimes affects how you lay out the project as well. That's one of the things that we touched on that.
On a project like that, Mark, what was the timeline between the two phases? Like years or?
Trying to remember what they didn't really, we didn't really have a specific. I mean, it wasn't going to be immediate. It was just something they wanted. They didn't need all the land that they were purchasing for this initial facility. But they knew they would use it eventually. Didn't have a specific time frame. If anybody else recalls, there was a time frame to that, but I don't think. AP Bowie, just what you're talking about, Kaiser Permanente. This was a project we did in Prince George's County, and I just wanted to flip these two options up on the plan. This was a little bit more of a straightforward project because this was part of a planned sort of commercial community already called Fairview. And they had certain requirements about where to put the parking and where to put the buildings sort of already established in this case. And we did two basic options, which sort of highlights often the difference. But simply the parking orientation. They ultimately went with this sort of option because of the efficiencies, but essentially we looked at flipping the parking parallel with the long dimension of the property, which is usually the more efficient way, as opposed to going perpendicular to the property line. You generally don't get as an efficient use of parking there. So again, the project, how we do layouts, this is sort of how we approach this one. To list of projects. Garrison Properties. This was a commercial project with a Wawa in the lower part of the property. I could try and blow this up a little bit. So in this case, the Wawa had sort of a predetermined dimensional plan that they gave us. Not only did they have a building footprint established, but they also had how they wanted their site to circulate pretty well established. And that really took a certain amount of land in the front of the property. And in order to grade it the way that they needed to have it graded and move their trucks around safely, it required this rather intensive retaining wall. And you can see, we often in these sketches, I'll do the contouring in red sometimes, and the layout in black to sort of help you too. But the remaining land on the top was then developed into office. And these were also terraced into the slope so that this was actually 2 stories of office. Entered on the high side as well as entered on the lower side. This was one of our very initial layouts. And again, you can see in this case, the parking actually drove the dimension of the building. We didn't have a building footprint requirement from the client. He just wanted us to maximize the square footage of office and parking. And by wrapping the perimeter of the site with parking, holding the sort of minimum distances from the edge of the parking of the building, we ended up with these footprints, which are a little bit narrower than most office buildings. I think these were 80 feet. A lot of times I'd like to see 100 or 120 feet on office buildings. This was a little study we did just to sort of talk about commercial properties and drive-throughs. This is in Baltimore County. They have very specific requirements for drive-throughs and how many spaces you have to have. This was a corner of that. The Wawa was actually across the street to the top of the page here. And they wanted to consider putting a bank in this location rather than a retail use. There were some zoning implications to that. But to lay it out, it requires the 7 stacking spaces behind the actual transaction station. And you need to have that clear. You can have, these stacked up cars blocking parking. So that was a critical element to figure out in order to then determine, well, how can we lay out the parking based on, having that lane access. So, and again, grading was roughly laid in here, and you can see the retaining walls that were required in order to make it fit against the actual Garrison School was across the street, was adjacent here, across the street, the road. Reisterstown Road is to the left here. So there was an area for dumpsters, there's areas for parking, there's ADA access, like I said. It's important to understand, that's got to be level. So those were again the same layout criteria. Another type of institutional property are schools. As you know, we've done a couple. This is Honeygo Elementary, and I think Christy probably remembers this. That's sort of the layout and the grading combined. In this case, with schools, you aren't usually they're not maximizing every square foot of land, although Lansdowne did a pretty good job of that. But they had a building footprint. The architects had a building footprint, and much like Lansdowne, the Honeygo Elementary School was a 2-tiered architectural sort of concept with, the northern half of the building was connected to the second level of the southern half of the building. And this is very similar to what we did at Lansdowne, but that was sort of the key is, how do you fit that into the site? We ended up with these retaining walls that sort of project out from the building because sure enough, very close to where the grade change occurs in the building is where the entrances are to the building. That was the case at Lansdowne as well. So you have the main entry and you got the 2 retaining wall there. So in this case at Honeygo, we had a lot of wetlands that were already defined that limited our, grading areas. And we had an access out to Joppa Road all the way out here. And there was actually a bridge connection. So this was a little complicated, but the access came across a bridge and then drove up to the site. And the parking for the parents, the students, and drop off all occurred in essentially a loop with the orientation of the parking parallel to the building. And then we drove around to the back to have staff parking in the rear. Again, we sort of take these awkward shapes of the property and try to lay out the parking as efficiently as we can. And at this stage, I always like to put in a little extra green space, measuring parking spaces at 9 feet, not 8.5. We're always sort of a little bit more generous with our dimensions because sure enough, as you finalize these projects, there's a transformer that's got to be located at the last minute. There's, another issue with a utility or a tree or, stormwater pond might need to be expanded. So I try to leave a little bit of extra space and plenty of green space so we can always tighten it up as the project develops. So this was a project where the layout was fairly straightforward. The service to the building was up at the north end of the building and the trucks could easily get in and out. We also had buses, talk about vehicular traffic being a critical element to think of early on. You know, the buses wanted to come in and immediately be able to park. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the actual plan that was built. This was changed because they actually wanted the buses to have direct access to the bus drop off. And if you were a parent dropping off your child, it's okay, you have to make a right-hand turn to get to the entrance, but the buses, we don't want them to have to turn to get into the bus loop. So the dominant flow for the school traffic was the bus traffic, which was an interesting experience we had there. And of course, the buses were down at the lower level, entering the lower level, and the student parking was, parent parking was up at the upper level. Staff as well was at the upper level.
You got real small parking spots if they were the drivers.
So the buses, you mean?
You go 4.5 with them, you know, the smaller cars.
Yes, that's right. And then, of course, the grading was typical. This was, actually, that was the grading plan I was showing you earlier. This is for the layout plan, so it's a little clearer. So, you know, these odd shapes that were sort of remaining between the wetlands and the building were potential play areas or educational gardens. And I think there's a little amphitheater we actually ended up building down in this lower part as well. But, so talk about awkward shapes of land to sort of fill in, but yet try to make it work efficiently. Just a challenge. Feel free to share any history or experience you might have with some of these projects or questions you might have and wonder why that was always done that way. Going over all these, but LCB, save it for last. This was just you're all familiar with this project. This is another type of institutional land use that we work with. Again, it becomes about the building footprint, the building orientation. How do you get the vehicles in and out safely? And in this case, we were sort of limited to the northern side of the property, trying to keep the southern side open, the community. Wanted to preserve this open space, as you all might be aware. And the pedestrian access then was sort of secondary to what we did try to manage to make sure there was a way to walk through the site on this north side and then be able to walk all the way around the project for the residents that would live. This is a assisted living facility. And, you know, the courtyards were sort of preliminarily located. Service, this is a little bit tight for service, but this meets the client's requirements for trash and there's an emergency generator in this side. The front door is sort of right next to the service, so we purposely tried to leave a little extra green space in this location so you didn't feel like, even though that was fairly close, it was sort of around the corner and behind the trees. So it was a little awkward where the front door is on the same side of the building as the service and loading. Just sort of a unique layout issue there. Let's see what else. So that is sort of the commercial and institutional approach. It really becomes about make sure you understand the building footprints, which way you want to orientate the commercial building. Dimensions of parking, that 60-foot bay. You know, we do a lot of, you know, you can angle parking when things get tight. But 9 times out of 10, angled parking just simply isn't as efficient as perpendicular parking. So we always try to accomplish the parking requirements with perpendicular parking. It's just more efficient use of the materials and cost. But when we're really pinched on sites and you can't get 3 bays of parking, but you need those 180 spaces, you can do one-way circulation and angle park. And sort of achieve the same parking and fit it into the dimension, but it's sort of a last resort option that we think of. Any questions about institutional or commercial land uses? Okay. I'll start where I ended. Bosley Estates was actually a residential project before it was an assisted living facility, so some original early sketches that we did. So with residential, it's a little bit different. It now becomes, I want to say the word cookie cutter, nobody really likes that, but I mean, these are, building footprints are now modular. I mean, there's a certain size building and it's repeated on the property. So understanding what the dimensions of the builder's requirements are for the building footprint. And in this case, sometimes it's just a basic rectangle. They haven't done final architectural plans. But we were looking at, how to maximize the density. Again, this green space really wanted to be kept. And in this case, these were all garages built into the townhouses. So in this option, the garages were in the rear of the buildings and accessed from the rear, and the front doors face the green space. So the options are really more about how are we orienting these buildings? And in this case, it was oriented towards the green space in the front, not towards the streets or the perimeter. Then look at another option. For concerns about that, maybe the adjacent residents might not like looking at garage doors. So now we turned the garages around, flipped it, and said, here's a study where all of these now have their fronts are where the garage doors are. The backs don't have garage doors facing the community, but they're still rear yards. So this is a study to sort of show how we, to get the same size unit laid out on the property without having garages face the perimeter. This was another study that was done. Now we face the garages and the front doors around the perimeter and left the open space in the center facing everyone's backyard. So it's another whole other approach. And often we're looking at, sometimes you have to lay out what all the options are for someone to sort of weigh all of the pros and cons of each option. So this was another sketch that was done. I think David Martin, another LA that went to work here, was instrumental in this. This was another concept where we should worry about the green space. Let's try and maximize the density and do this as efficiently as possible, facing the garages with each other with the street that went through. So the perimeter of the site was green. So lots of ways to, oops. Parks Lot 4. This was a piece of land up in Sparks that was actually zoned for commercial use, but a client was considering rezoning it to residential use and asked us to do some layouts of townhouses on this property to see what kind of density that they could get. So again, there were certain footprints that we had to sort of work with. Which way do we want to orient the buildings? And we sort of came up with 3 different options. This the entrance is from the west here. Like I said, this is up in Sparks and Valley. It's an odd shaped property. There was, in this case, stormwater already, facilities already built, sort of prepped that we would be utilizing. And we looked at there were a lot of sketches done prior to even the preparation of this plan, trying to come up with what's the most efficient way to lay out these blocks of, if you know the size of the units, and then the front yard needs to park a car, the rear yard needs about 30 feet. You can come up with these larger blocks of a cluster of housing and just sort of move these all around the property. And I will say this is I find it faster to do this by hand. I haven't been convinced when we're this early in the project that we can do this on the computer as time efficiently. It's just faster to work by hand. Trace paper. Save this piece, throw that piece away, try it a different way. It's just a lot faster. And as you can see, this dimension from this north-south dimension really worked efficiently to get 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks with the road right away that we needed to get in and get out. So that was kind of a no-brainer to orient the buildings that direction. The front was a little bit wider, So we ended up with sort of this own little finger of land that had a double-sided sticks of towns, both sides of the road. So we called this, and I was able to leave sort of an open space here in the center as sort of an amenity for the whole community, and we call this the Central Park option. This was another layout. Because I should go back and note what the density count was. This was 116 units. This is 104. And in this case, we particularly decided to create courts. Again, we still have that same dimension block with the townhouse and the rear yard, front yard requirements. But if we flipped it and created a court lengthwise perpendicular to the width of the property, we could do that 3 times. And this little sort of chunk of land to the south created its own sort of court and flanked the entrance. So it's just a whole nother, after you flip these blocks around, you come up with so many different ways to approach it. We try to come up with 3 very distinct options. This was another. This was only 102 units. And this was a little bit more of a random approach. Where we simply paralleled the units as much as we can with the side property line, created an upper court and then sort of a lower loop road because the grade sort of wanted to have it, these houses want to be lower than the grades up here. So this is where we sort of let the grading sort of creep in and dictate the layout. So we had 102 units. Anybody want to take a guess at which plan had the most units on it based upon cost efficiency?
So the first one.
16. 16. If I don't have the third one on here. 4. So this layout to the west of the property really gained a lot of efficiency. So we had 116 units. So that was just
Would this require retaining walls? If you don't.
yeah, I know. What we usually do when we usually check the cross slope. Because there's sort of a maximum slope you can do across the front of townhouses. And I assume we were able to achieve the elevation we needed to get down and be able to this one up. I do not show a retaining wall back here.
Well, that was in that.
You noted earlier that you accommodate for stormwater management, and a little bit extra here and there. Do you look at open space as well?
Open space. Well, we know early on with the number of units that you have here, there's going to be a significant amount of open space, and that's hence the reason for the Central Park sort of idea in the beginning. So we are sort of creating that.
There's no way this meets local open space requirements. I guess he knows the goal of the client in the beginning, whether they want to meet it or whether they want to ask for it.
I just noticed you had more green spaces in each layout. So I was thinking in terms of, you were probably, is there any factor, because open spaces, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just looking back, Eric, I think most of the I don't really have the open space criteria as an early program number to try and be focused on.
Most of them are looking at maximizing the footprint, whatever it
Yeah,
is.
it's
How much money they can make, and then, the open space, if they have to pay a fee, we pay a fee.
right. I mean,
But also.
if I just how many times I measured the width of a property and length and width and cross-checked it with how many bays of units we can get within that dimension to try and get the efficiency. That's really the initial driving force, is that layout. Then, especially with an odd-shaped property like this, there's usually spaces left over to accommodate some of the other needs.
Did one of these 3 layouts get constructed?
They didn't get the zoning.
Mark, when you're laying out these things, there any things that you know, as the layout relates to, say, you know, length of road or utility? I see a lot of people focusing. Is there an efficiency?
Yeah. Darn good Waters Landing. After we had done all that, the double, you know, the single loaded roads is really not very cost effective for developers, because by the time they build the road, build the sewer, build the water, and only have houses on one side of the road, it didn't make economic sense. And at Waters Landing, we ended up making some changes to the layout. A lot of detail work had been done. I don't have examples of that in here, but that's actually was quite a few learning curve. The other rule of thumb is, you know, the parking generally is most efficient running parallel to the long dimension of the property. You know, it sounds kind of simple, but rarely do we ever take the parking and run it perpendicular to the long dimension of the property. So, that's sort of a rule of thumb. Always get a more efficient parking use for commercial and institutional properties, particularly when you parallel it to the long dimension of the property. Other rules of thumb, utilities aren't something that we're really thinking about too much early on. Again, it's getting that efficient layout of the dimensions of buildings and the roads. And then a clever engineer comes in and figures out how to get all the sewer. But no, it's just a priority process. Stormwater, I mean, we do this all with Christy and I worked on a lot of things where I think you have a good understanding. You don't really expect to see stormwater layout or areas for bioretention ponds very early in the sketches, because it's just something that we find a way to fit it in.
Sometimes I have to say to you, we know that's too much density.
Yeah.
We're never gonna fit stormwater. Like the next
And that's
one's
an
gonna
intuitive
trigger.
thing. After you've done it 100 times, you sort of know the level of
I
density.
saw Suburban Club on it.
That's a good example.
Good segue.
Yeah, I was gonna say, Mark, I know on Southland Hills, that one has management issues. So projects where it's not just talking bioretention, but it's talking about 100-year management. I mean, there are a couple of those layouts I'm not sure we would ever been able to manage, because you have to be able to capture the water, and that one's a weird one because it basically drains 3 different ways. And the main way, you know, if you lose all of your water into the existing roads, we can't pull it back into the site to manage it. So, you know, depending on whether you're just looking at quality versus quantity, sometimes that quantity drainage idea really does need to be thought about early, because every layout's not going to make that work. Because that one where everything sort of went to the outside makes me cringe, because I'm not sure how we would have captured all that water. So that's something that comes up, and, you know, a lot of times it's, yeah, okay, go be that really smart civil designer and make this work. And, you know, in my 20 some years, there's sometimes it's like, I don't know why you think I can make this work. It's literally impossible from the layout, you know, that's presented. So
The concept doesn't work well with that stormwater management. There's a lot of opportunity to collaborate on some of these things early on. And understanding the bioretention requirements versus what did you call it? The volume requirements?
correct, the quantity. Mhm.
Yeah, that's something where I really need the engineer to help me. Sure, I do that. Moving on to the Suburban Club. This was a project where we created 5 options. We were working for the potential buyer of the property initially, and they had the building footprint program for us to use, and they wanted clusters of 3 and 4 townhouses of certain dimensions, and they wanted garages in the front. And this was, you know, this was not one of the earlier layouts, but, again, the dimension of the land really sort of dictated what you could sort of do. We had this, and, I didn't mention early on, but, where the wetlands occur and specimen trees occur are also things we really need to think about early on. And have that information right up there along with the building footprints. Because in this case, that was sort of critical, making the decisions to how this could sort of lay out.
Especially since specimen trees these days are scrutinized over protection
Yeah.
and can be impacted. And we've seen recently a project that got approved with a bunch of specimen trees impacted. When they went before the ALJ, they basically couldn't get the development plan approved because that variance was then denied by the ALJ. And that's just a big overall look. So you really have to have good justification. And, in this case, I think we communicated quite a bit about the trees. I went out there and did an
Yeah,
analysis.
we did all that first.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that kind of gave you, well, if you can save these are in poor condition, so clearly anything in poor or fair is easier to impact. This would also have, a lot of different layout changes because they kept telling you, we think we can use this area now too.
Yeah, that's right. This is, originally this area behind this, driving range was not usable. We had a 6 acre sort of limitation and it was on this. And then when they realized they didn't have the density, they were able to get what they wanted. They weren't able to get the density. They were willing to the club was willing to look at moving their driving range to free up some additional land to make, density get to where they needed to make the numbers work. So I apologize, this is a little out of order. I have option 1. Yeah, I think these were the options that we did working for the club. This isn't the options we did for Keelty. Keelty was the potential buyer. And it's all very confidential, by the way. So this was, at the point where we had the ability to use this additional land for about 36 multifamily units. And the idea came up, well, maybe, they have an entrance to their golf club right here. And if you recall, the last study, actually, the plan was to use that as the entrance to this residential community. So you'd actually drive into the club. That's where everyone who's coming to the club enters and then turn and go into this community. But we looked at one option where maybe we don't do that. And there's residential communities across the street. So the context works very well. That we could create an entrance in this southwestern corner and come into the project and dead end here. Now the houses still faced the front, the orientation, but the road was approached a slightly different way. And again, the dimension from this point to this point was key in being able to say, a lot, a road, lot, road. I mean, it just sort of, once you sort of understand those dimensions, then the layout starts to become a little. And this is where Christy was beginning to worry and get nervous about stormwater area, but,
I think I was worried on the last one too. Well, it's a quantity and quality one, and you need both, and
Yeah.
there's just not. I think you did a good job. And none of these meet open space. We were hoping open
Yeah,
space would
yeah.
be considered the fact that we're next to the golf club, and then maybe they actually the suburban club could dedicate some space.
In this option, they actually thought, if we did semi-detached units rather than sticks of 3 and 4 townhouses, that even if they get less units, it actually would be more income, more value. So we looked at a similar layout, but instead of townhouses, we basically put in duplexes. And you can see in the lower right corner here, this is kind of important. This is the whole sort of planning. Each one of these options had sort of an establishment. I wanted to make sure that the client understood that this is what we were allowing for. But,
You
Anyway.
can drag that, move it. Yeah, just grab it anywhere. Okay, copy that too.
So, so this is what I was talking about early on, making sure you're clear on this. And in this case, I wanted to make sure the client, we were actually asking for a little bit tighter front setbacks, only 20 feet instead of 25 to park a car. The right of way was an extra narrow road, 24 feet of paving on a 44-foot right of way. You know, and the county would likely require a 20-foot, that's why this white space was here. There's a 20-foot green strip required for the 30-foot yard on the houses that face this state road. So this was establishing some of those design parameters. I think if we go back, here it is with this townhouses, 44 and a 24 and 44, 25-foot setbacks to that. Which is what we were normally using 30-foot rear yards. But when we went to this duplex option, it was starting to tighten up and the client felt that he could make 20 feet in the front yard work. And this was sort of, I think, the most desirable that they liked. And these again were duplex units. They liked the entrance ultimately from the club entrance, not here. And we ended up with one single mixed with the rest all duplex, a total 37 units. And the driving range had to shift back. So this is pretty efficient and pretty tight. So
The house on the very top, most northern house doesn't have a backyard.
well, it does. There's a pedestrian golf cart trail that loops around the back here, but and it's downhill from the club, so this doesn't feel like they're looking right into their backyard. This is down a little lower. Does that make sense? Right? Is that what you're worried about, Christie, right there?
Yeah, I mean, they would actually have to buy more property.
Well, if you look at the template, it's only a little 30-foot requirement.
Yeah, go small, see
Yeah.
30-foot of green color.
Yeah, the green bubble wasn't quite
Okay.
the right shape to really truly accommodate that, but I felt there was room to make that work. They might have to add a little bit more to their total land area of developable land, yeah. So, single family. Well, we talked a little bit on that. I just brought up a couple to Bosley. This was actually, no, these were single family. Yeah, this was a Bosley Estates was, again, as a PUD, we were exceeding the county minimums with distances between buildings and setbacks. And this was sort of again, where we were sort of getting this was a footprint that we helped the client find where they could do 4 single-family units tightly clustered. And then we did a plan where that so then this was a very quick sort of study. Then rather than taking those blocks of townhouses with the front yard, the rear yard, total block of land required for a townhouse, this was a block of land required for these 4 units. And we really tried to see how tightly we could pack these sort of into the site. They all entered off of the perimeter of the project into a cluster of 4. And this is when we were looking at not saving the green space really that was there. This pool is located where it is because that's sort of a natural low point on the property. But this was an exercise in how we could really cluster single family homes in a way to maximize the density. Didn't really pan out. This was just, again, how great that when you get really tight like this with single family homes, the grading becomes so important because you really can only change the grade so much between houses and clusters that are that tight. So that's why we sort of did this very quick sort of grading study to understand, how much fall could you really accomplish between these units. It's rather challenging. This is a rendering of the same thing. Just to sort of show each one of these had certain elevation, but see how tight that is? I mean, you sense, in Florida where they do this sort of thing all the time, the land is flat, so. It's wrong, but here we have something called topography. This was another, single family, a couple of detached, semi-attached units. Another strategy, we did a lot of layout studies to sort of make this work. Again, you can see how tight it was. We're not meeting the standard county setbacks. This is a PUD. And also the attached units were internal to the project and the perimeter of the site was wrapped with single family so that we respected the context of the site. This was sort of, I think, Delbert's last try to do something here.
Yeah, I think we had this fully.
Yeah. And the numbers couldn't work, and then they brought in LCB. Assisted with this. Makes a lot of sense. Villas was a practically single family units, and there was some interesting. Again, this process we go through, understanding the footprints. These were some homes that they wanted us to consider trying to make work. So I established the overall footprint dimensions and created these modules down here at the bottom. 6-foot wide single and 50-foot wide singles. Once we understood what those dimensions were, then we could start the process of laying these out on the plan. These are all 50-foot wide. I don't see any darker colored units.
This is actually where we ended, not where we started.
Okay, so this was sort of the beginning. I suppose the grading just overlaid on it. So this is, again, sort of getting the layout to work. Now this is again, we measure the property north-south, we measure it east-west. What's the most efficient way of getting the units in there? And in this case, running parallel to the long dimension of the property, made the most sense again. And we had stormwater facilities in each corner because of the layout drove that. And this is actually a good example where once we got into the stormwater, we got into some of the regulations in order to actually, this is where it ended up, right? This is, we originally had the stormwater in the middle. No, we ended up with it in the middle because of the.
This is not quite where we ended, but it's closer to the end.
Yeah.
You did a whole bunch of other sketches. I thought you finished.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
Oh, with the curving roads and stuff.
But actually, I think I do have some of it here, but
Where the roads weren't parallel to each other and it was one shaped road and.
yeah.
Can you tell us where the stormwater is?
But this, the point I wanted to sort of make was this ended up that the outfall of the stormwater facility in this corner had a dam break risk. And if we sunk it here in the middle, so here's where the stormwater design actually came back and affected the layout once we got into the nuts and bolts. There are some of the other options that Christie was talking about here. This was some of the earlier layouts that we were looking at. I can sort of do that. Again, trying to figure out which is the right dimension to get the most efficiency. And actually, if we did it, if we didn't surround the perimeter with backyards, we could actually get some efficiency this way. This is then where we decided to wrap the perimeter with the lots to keep all the roads to the interior. So it's a similar concept in that we did it the same way. We wrapped the lots around the perimeter, but the interior was only one lot deep. And so which road do you put those on? Flipped back and forth. It's a little different approaches. This is the curved road one I think Christie was talking about. Again, we have sort of the opportunity to do lot, road, lot, road, so you couldn't get a double-sided road, but, which is frowned upon. This was another way to sort of try and accomplish the same layout. This was another. Instead of the road being against the southern boundary, if we pushed it to the north, what happened? This actually, because this is a longer dimension than the northern side, the efficiency of the density of units was more efficient across the southern side. This actually had a 30 lot count, which was higher. So that sort of brings me to the conclusion of our
Mark,
Mhm.
how to navigate to transfer in. Job. Very earliest piece of information that came to us. Planning study by another outfit,
Yeah.
and just to contrast where they started.
That 21 of those, there was all.
You know, there was the high hopes.
I knew it by heart.
That's my baby.
Oh. Pages here. Yeah, so this was the plan that they came to us with.
Lawn trees.
I'm sure the community would have loved that.
And then, again, they understood their footprints for buildings, and they knew what
Stormwater.
And from a density perspective, it's consistent with what's across the street, but not with what's behind it and south of it.
So you can see they sort of had the same, one of the studies that we had done was similar to this with, road, lot, road, lot. And the north-south axis.
Question for everybody. How do they accommodate parking for residences like this?
Good question. So, single family with garages. Baltimore County requires additional guest parking above and beyond. I'm sorry, I take that back. Single family parking with 2-car garages, you generally don't have to provide additional guest parking. They have the 2 parking spaces per unit which required. I think there's an additional requirement above and beyond that for guests, but when you start doing townhouses, you can't get the 2 units for parking, so you end up having to create areas of guest parking. I'm sorry, I don't have a more exact answer than that, right? I think if I look up the regulations, I can let you know, or check that exactly is. Because I think there is a requirement for guest parking for single family. You can put it, but it's not as intense as it is when you have multi.
Porter's Venue is a good example, just because aside from that semi-detached, everything else has
There was still some
Ancillary
guest parking,
parking.
yeah.
throughout. Good time to look at it, and I think the parking requirements are on the development plan on the first page. Thank you. Michelle.
Included in any auxiliary parking on each lot.
Yeah, I think if you have your 1-car garage or your 2-car, if you have a 2-car garage, you probably want to have 1 car with, obviously, your driveway is your other parking space.
They can't.
People don't.
No, they don't. No. Well, that's because they want to get out of the garage and you're in the way.
My neighbor has converted his whole garage to his gym. So his 2 parking spaces are not. And of course, he has 3 teenage kids between him and hers. And her 2 cars. And
Parking
so they
spaces.
occupy almost all of our auxiliary parking.
Yeah.
Just with that one family and that other family that has his and hers kids that live drive.
Your family converted their garage into a dog house, like a big dog room. They had 9 Newfoundlands, that all lived in the garage. Oh my goodness. Don't even think about how much money they spent on food for that one.
I bet you the garage was nice and warm with all those dogs in there.
It's funny, we were just talking about the no load versus single load versus double load. We're out at Waters Landing. I was explaining to Sarah, who drove over to Vincent Farm. Because that was one where we used that as our justification to actually put houses in the buffer. Because the buffer and extent of the buffer, you know, you have so much no load. There's gonna be a financial hardship to find. So we ended up putting houses, it's one of the first projects in a while that we put houses. Reduce the buffer for houses. But that's where it comes into play, and it really is a logistic that some people forget about. All that infrastructure costs money. You don't have houses on both sides. It's hard to absorb that cost.
Yeah, that was,
Philosophy of building, is that a?
yeah, I don't know that you're gonna get that
You would have been.
nowadays.
Yeah, you would.
You're at a very pro building developing. Administration of that.
One of the very first variances I ever did was for developer. But he was fond of saying, we can't. That was the bat.
And listening to your dialect, if it's who I think it
Yeah,
is.
it is.
That was also a developer that was very proactive with the administration of, you know, whereas, right, and working with the administration, so doing, you know, I may need a favor, but I'm gonna do what I can somewhere else.
Good representation.
He did, he really did
I
that.
mean, I knew right away as soon as we started, I'm like, oh, I can see him. Is that him?
Is that him in the corner of the home?
Well, this in person, had that. They took back.
No. No, we didn't do that one, thank you. That's not our name. But that comes back to a lot of the stuff too, that when we were talking, you know, Eric, even though that flew, no load versus single load versus double. Fact of the matter is you always have to look at all of your alternatives that they prepare. I think we looked at them from every aspect to say, okay, you know, we don't look at it as to what you can't do, it's what's gonna be troublesome or, you know, what environmental requirement would be necessary and is it feasible? That's the real question. That's good stuff. Did you find it, Mark? It's on the development plan.
Is this is the, one of the earlier.
No, it
concept
would be on the development plan, which was a folded plan. Trying to remember.
Anyway, this is, just while I have this exhibit up, this is where they ended up not building these units here.
Yeah, we have to abandon that.
Yeah, it was not cost effective to one side. And by the time they built the sewer and the water, they couldn't justify. the
Well, that
cost.
wasn't the real reason. The real reason was growth allocation wasn't gonna allow us to impact that much wetland.
Okay,
That was the real,
okay,
was-
'cause I remember coming in
at
there.
the end of the day, that's what it came down to was, yeah, there were certain.
Yeah, this was some different studies we were looking at. Make that efficient.
The amount of ancillary parking is pretty cool. It's all put in.
Eric, is there a plan where you,
Yeah, go there,
0163?
you go J,
J, okay, or
J, not
JL?
J4, J,
All right,
and go to, yep, there, go approvals. Parking counts are on the road, Father's Lane. Yeah, we covered separate. Okay, I'm just noting.
it is, okay.
Are you in here?
No, I'm not in J.
ENGR,
Why don't they were next to each other?
Okay.
And the very bottom one, first refined development plan. Um, expand
With
the
electricity or anything?
You can even reduce files. The second file is probably has all the sheets if you want that. But no, not
Oh,
that.
okay.
Second one I said,
Materials and
not the
construction.
second from the bottom.
Gotcha.
That's 30 or 40 grand.
Chart. The big, I think it's the big chart above the house types
So
right
like,
there.
if you're like had a bunch of houses.
Yeah.
Like how, like. how do I-
What do you, it's 2 per unit and then there's, if it's townhouse, there's a requirement for, visitor parking.
Right, but there's not a requirement for visitor parking.
You really.
There's not,
There-
your roads have to be wide enough for parking on the street, but they don't allow the 24-foot.
Sarah, that was the single family doesn't have a visitor parking requirement, the road has to be wide enough to.
Okay.
Towns have a visitor parking.
Visitor
requirement.
parking requirement. If it's 2-car garage, it's 15% of your overall parking requirement. If it's a 1-car garage, it's 30%. Pretty big.
Do you have to sign a document that says you won't convert your garage or?
Yes.
Obviously. Like they did in 1999.
Yeah, this is Christine. So the reason we didn't build the units back here with the single loaded road was
The wetlands,
the wetlands, okay?
the impacts, great, that's a huge wetland right there.
Were you shooting?
Priority.
No, I just. I was in that city, I'm moving all the meetings, I was in the TV when this development said that we couldn't build it.
Eric told you wrong somewhere 5 minutes ago while you were.
No. Yeah, he was like, well, this is gonna be too much road and too much of this, and I was like, no, that's too much wetland impact. No, this was all.
No, they do it when they have to, they just complain about it, but,
Yeah.
you know, they gotta get back to the point.
Yeah,
Zoom in though, because the parking, like in phase 1, I mean, the ancillary parking is
Over
over
here.
here. Yeah,
Well, it's it's peppered.
and, yeah, and then it's from there, it's a large piece, but you have others.
I guess parking up there, yeah. So visitor parking is up here and.
There's close to it, yeah.
There's a little bit. per unit.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
This, there's the visitor parking.
Yeah, there's a little bit, like,
It's all over the place, yep.
little,
And then there's,
we
yeah,
have a wider road in the back.
I lived in apartments that part of their shtick was that you got a garage. So when they did their parking counts and setups, they included all the garage parking in their numbers. So in theory, on paper, they had enough parking. Except no one used the garages for parking. They used them for all their junk. Or they had 2 and 3 vehicles. So we always had parking issues. I don't know that the apartments ever got to the point where they checked, but they were getting close to saying, hey, you're not using your garage, so, you know, you're gonna have to start. But I did both, so I was okay.
they put that in their HOA docs, so I bet.
Yeah, it's in the HOA doc, they would require a note on the development plan that says you won't convert your garage to living space. You know, you won't use it for storage.
Well, but see, your gym may not be living space, so that's how you get around that.
I'm still putting car in here, I can move this stuff out of the way.
I mean, we do make, so for 2-car house, 2-car garage houses, there's 2 cars fit in the garage and 2 in the driveway.
That's
And we never count all 4. We always just say it's 2.
Yeah.
There's been one project where we've had to count. I think Towson
Muse,
Muse,
yeah,
we counted,
there's no
we had to count it all,
driveways.
because there's no visitor parking there.
Yeah.
But it's typical that people really get 4, we just count 2.
Talk about that when I walk through there. They have the little apron before their
They-
garage off the alley, but that's it. And that's not even enough to put a car.
Yeah, but you have lots of, in that situation, you have lots of street park,
Yes. You do have.
especially evenings and weekends.
We added-
It's right there at the business.
Spaces on Pennsylvania.
Did they get? They recognize that, it's
It was applied, so this is different.
interesting. What were you gonna ask?
If you're still looking to sell your Peloton, Brady, that's your Joseph and I.
Who?
Not really.
He's getting rid of his own gym.
This is, where's that little bar come up?
little bar, the cat now.
Just click on Teams down at the bottom.
I mean, that-
I don't know how you find anything with that, with your home screen.
Click the little way.
That's a pretty home screen. I like the background.
How can you see it? No offense, Mark, but
Laura Lindsay found the same thing. I used to look at her computer and go, wow.
So that is I'm gonna stop the recording. If that's the end of anybody have any other questions they want to ask about layouts or? Sure. Sure.
No, that's not a question, but more of a comment. I did not realize this much went to landscape architecture. I thought it was mostly just laying out landscapes, like plants. I did not realize you were so involved in designing up the plan.
Yeah.
Good to know.
That's called the planning part of it.
One question about the open space, so that's like an incentive to the developer, not actually a requirement by.
They're requiring, for every unit, residential unit, you give 1,000 square feet of it. So it doesn't matter if it's apartments, senior living, condos, singles, towns, you're supposed to do that. If you don't, there's a waiver, you pay a fee. Depending on what tier you're in for the fee, it can be millions of dollars. Or it can be 50, it can be a drop in the bucket, or it can be millions, so it's a huge piece of fees. Zoning, they pretty much, obviously.
A couple of the tiers are based on use.
Right,
Like
there's all different.
Senior
yeah,
living
there's
is in a different tier regardless of the zone, but.
It is getting very much more of a test. You don't provide it. Why are you not providing it? Have you looked off-site? Have you looked to buy more property elsewhere to actually provide it? Whereas before it used to be, okay, we like your layout, we understand. Waiver. It's not that way anymore, so it is something Mark needs to be thinking of, Mark and his group need to be thinking about, because it's getting more and more difficult.
And often when we get a multifamily plan or a commercial or institutional type project, the footprint's already sort of established, and the architect has done a layout where they've maximized
Right,
the site and we're sort of.
so we're stuck,
in-
yeah.
Yeah,
I'm thinking more lots, like.
yeah, when we do single family homes and lots, then we can sort of control.
We control the
Right,
layout, yeah. And then the client can say, forget that.
Yeah.
You can find open space. Is it used to be like a fourth primary, also
No, no,
Concept.
There's-
Right?
the definition now is like, has to have average slope of 15% or less. And I don't think there's a width requirement. There used to be, it had to be 75 feet or wider. But I think they dropped that. It has to be accessible to at least the people that live in your neighborhood. It cannot really be encumbered by environmental easements unless you're proposing a path through it or some kind of trail system.
Like the trails, water zones.
Yeah.
For deer.
Yeah, so that would count those areas.
Yeah. There's several areas out at Baltimore Crossroads where we put trails into population for the same reason. A lot of that was dictated by Baltimore County's planning, saying we want our bike paths connection, we want
Right.
certain things.
that is required to, they have an environment.
Yeah,
There's long back through.
But I'll still sum it up in that the geometry and the dimensions and maximizing the layout and the density is really the driver. You can always pull that back to accommodate an open space or a small.
Don't we just take the town?
Right, right. But from a layout design standpoint, we always try and find out what's that sweet spot as far as the dimensions go. Understanding those dimensions and being able to traffic.
yeah, it used to be good enough to give, okay, if you have to give 50,000 square feet, you just, okay, here are the green, you know, it's gonna be flat, it's just gonna be landscape, but it's just be grass, they can go play in. But now it's like, oh no, that's not good enough, you need to build a few amenities and trails and gazebos and benches and like in villas, we gave double the open space required. And it still wasn't good enough. They still wanted a walking trail and benches and a bike and a dog waste pickup stations and gates and
But we gave them more because we had to for tree preservation.
Right. Yeah, but at the same time, it's still giving them double what they
Right.
need, with what they require. It should be good enough, and it wasn't.
Yeah, okay, you were doing like amenities and stuff to convince them it was good enough. I did not know you had like double the square footage.
So it's a little harder. I think single family is the hardest. They really want you to have that space.
Things like, you think of the townhomes where people don't have so much
Townhomes
yard.
too, yeah, there's, townhomes are probably just as bad, but apartments, they always have interior space where people can share and live, and then they've got interior courtyards and stuff, so that's definitely where the regs lack.
Sure, well,
Get a
especially,
community pool, that would help.
They shouldn't have to be 1,000 square feet
yeah,
per unit.
well, especially when they're building vertically, like Avalon and Hunt Valley.
Yeah, they're-
It's 6 stories, 320 units.
Yeah.
It's like a 2.7 acre piece of land, and they're supposed to have 3.5 acres of open space.
How you.
Tell me how that works.
You have to buy all site.
We're getting a waiver and they're paying a fee, but like, the idea is like, well, is there neighboring land that's for sale that's not developed that you can turn into a county
Yeah.
park?
Can Greenberg Givens give anything? And you had to go look at Oregon Ridge, just to see if Oregon Ridge had any.
They talked to the Parks and Rec
Improvements.
department, they were like, we have no plans to do anything, even if you gave us the money, we wouldn't use it. This is basically what they told them, they were like. and Jim Herman specifically told us, don't put that in your letter, it's embarrassing. You offered the Parks and Rec money, and Parks and Rec said, we don't have anything to do with it, don't give it to us.
Something.
I didn't realize they were using, I guess it's what soil conservation is. They use, they have fields there too, not just on the other side.
Right, oh, yeah.
Last night I went in that way, they were.
Yeah,
I'm not sure if they were,
good.
I don't know if they were doing soccer.
Yeah, it's pretty,
At soccer, there's a couple, they do rec softball there.
Well, I knew the rec did the other side.
Yeah.
Of Lake Cuba, is that Cuba right there?
Okay.
But this was right in front of.
Yeah.
Lake.
right in front.
Yeah.
What used to be all ag land,
Right.
and it was
The
all
ag
corn,
center, whatever.
right, but it was always corn on both sides going up the lane. And then it's like,
Yeah. I
here
was
you are.
surprised.
Any more questions, anyone? Thanks.
So, yeah, all the idea is with the open spaces, your kids need somewhere to play.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You're building a house and you'll put more. There'll be too many kids at the parks that exist, so we need to build more.
I knew what it was like supposed to be used for, I just wasn't sure if it was like a requirement or an incentive. Yeah, get a discount on something or other.
Yeah, until you satisfy that, they're not gonna approve your development plan, and that's what he wants, so. Kind of at the mercy of Mr. Herman.
It's just sad, because even if you prove there's enough park space within walking distance, still not good enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the
Like,
county-
you'd rather give money to an existing park, to build something additional there.
If need
If it's within
be,
walking distance.
make an access, right, put a nice path leading to the park.
Right.
Would a pool in the building, say a rooftop pool or something that the residents had access to, would something like that count?
No, has to be on the ground.
If it was on the ground, like for instance, like we have a big interior courtyard at Avalon, that counts.
Okay.
But it's like 30,000 square feet of the 3.5 acres they're supposed to have.
It's so stupid that it counts if it's on the ground versus on the roof.
Yeah.
The public are still not allowed to use the Avalon courtyard. That's his
Yeah.
original argument.
Yeah,
So
it's
it
not-
makes 0
it's not-
sense.
Like a rooftop garden or something, or like green garden.
Yeah, no, that counts.
Yeah, exactly.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, like Ellicott Mill has a pool, it's raised up a couple stories or some, maybe 4 or something like that.
That doesn't
That won't count.
Yeah, well, and like Brightview, they're required to provide open space and inside they have like a pub and a library and a game room and none of that counts.
Is the pub in the library?
I think they're connected.
Interesting.
That coffee, phone.
It's not like.
Bookstore.
A lot of bucks to live there. And those people aren't really active.
No,
so it's
they're not-
like
they
they're
don't need
running
a
around
playground.
playing soccer.
Right, that, I don't trust, I don't even understand why it's a requirement.
That's exactly it.
But they would say they want somewhere to walk.
Yeah.
They want walking track.
But all this money that's coming in from the open space fees, the townsmen are buying up parks like crazy. Lazy Focus bought like 16 parks or something nuts in his district. And that's his whole thing. Oh, well, look what I'm buying, you know, for, on behalf of the county. With his,
What do you mean he's buying parks? The parks that the county didn't already own?
land, it's the county that's available for them to convert the parks.
Did that too.
Yeah.
Mark's one
Oh,
of the
yeah.
lines for you. Cause his newsletter, he always tells us, this
Mm-hmm.
park's opening, this park, we've
Right.
acquired land for.
So it's just funny, they have all these parks that can be built with the money, but it's Christie saying, you can't use that as a local close by credit. Oh, we're right here next to this, shouldn't it count? Because technically, most of that stuff was built with money that
Right.
came from the fund.
Right.
But I think part of it
The
is,
waiver.
if you think back to, what was it, 5 years ago, maybe longer. When there was such a stink with the open space money. that It got paid because of a development in Catonsville.
Right.
And it went towards the beautiful park out at
Whatever.
Reisterstown or
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Yeah.
It has an ice skating rink and ball fields and all this stuff.
Mhm.
And I think that's where it started getting
You mean when your buddy was in all?
Jim Smith. Oh, we
No,
have
not
beautiful
him,
parks.
Bob Barrett.
Well, Bob Barrett was
He's
there
in
with
charge of everything.
Dutch and with Jimmy. And Jimmy did it in Reisterstown. Jimmy did a lot. We had lots of nice parks. The lovely park you heard about with the Ravens giving money. That all started under Jimmy Smith. I think the design and all, because the park itself's been there.
Yeah.
The Ravens just redid this one section of it and put all that in. But yeah, Jimmy Smith built like 3 or 4 beautiful parks. And then the
Easter
Reisterstown,
Mills.
Mines Mills, right, the one
Yeah.
in Falls Road,
Yeah.
the one out by me has got nice skating rink, softball field, indoor soccer field. I think it has indoor basketball, huge.
Yeah.
Money came from someone else.
Right, exactly, Reisterstown did not.
Yeah, I'm gonna make sure you know because,
Not all that,
I need a
right.
park.
Reisterstown did not.
I need 2 parks.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Yep.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
You're welcome.